Now that we've learned how to feed the thread from the top bobbin and from the bottom, now we have our thread coming out of the back of the machine. Now we are able to start sewing. Now, before we get into how to sew, let's take a quick look at the controls on the front of the machine. Now, all sewing machines have one of these. This is basically a reverse switch. Sewing machines are controlled by a pedal. You usually have your hands quite busy while you're sewing, so it's good to be able to use your feet to drive the machine back and forth. But the pedal will only bring you in one direction. It'll only allow the fabric to feed through from the front to the back, unless you press down the reverse button. So while I'm holding down the reverse button now, as soon as I press that pedal, that's going to bring the fabric back. So this is exceptionally useful when you're starting off or finishing a stitch. So if I'm doing a stitch and I'm weaving that thread from top to bottom, from the beginning of my stitch to the end of my stitch, if I don't have some sort of tangle, some sort of knot, some sort of anchor at the beginning and at the end, then it's just a matter of time before you put your fabric in the wash, and then the fabric's just going to pull apart. The threads are going to come unwound. So to start, you usually want to start off by going over a little bit of your stitch and then go back. Go forward, go back. Do that a couple of times. So what that's going to do is basically create a little tangle. It's going to create a little knot. And then, as you continue through your stitch, you can do it as thin as you need. When you get to your end point, once again, you don't want to have a loose, like a loose spot. So then you finish your stitch, you get right to the end, and then you back up a little bit. Go forward, back up a little bit. Go forward, back up a little bit. So you'll see that this is going to give you a really good solid anchor. Then at the end of it, you'll be able to tug on that piece of fabric. You don't have to worry about that thin little stitch pulling apart. So reverse is important. Number two is this dial. Now, every machine is going to be a little different. Some of the older machines had basically a big metal tab that allowed you to go between a few settings. Most of the Singer sewing machines have a number of different stitches that you can choose. Now, since we're covering basic sewing, I'm not going to get into the crazy stuff. We're going to start off with a single straight stitch, which basically means the needle goes down, moves forward a perfectly straight path, down again, and so on. We're also going to cover a zigzag stitch where the needle goes alternating from right to left as it moves forward or back. So right now I have it in a straight stitch. Now there is a length adjustment up here. Now what that's going to do is determine how far apart those pokes are. So if I have that set to minimum, then the needle is going to go back, up and down, very, 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 very close intervals. On the other hand, if I'm only moving occasionally, now the stitch isn't going to be as strong, but I mean, sometimes you don't want to chew up your fabric. If I'm doing something like polyester or plastic or something, if you have your stitches too close together, you're creating a perforated like a seam that's going to allow you to be able to tear the fabric super easily. With other fabrics, like let's say you have denim, if you put a lot of the stitches, that's going to make it really solid. So there are pros and cons. There are different situations.
And that's the top one?
That's up here on this machine. So you could always count on there being one adjustment for how far apart the stitches are, and the other one to select what type of stitch. So right now we have it set on a straight stitch, and now I'm just going to do this very simply. So we have two pieces of fabric that I want to sew together. So we're going to put a single straight stitch along the edge here. So to do that, we're simply going to place the fabric. You can see where the needle is pointing, so it's pretty obvious. Wherever the needle is, that's where my stitch is going to start. And now, if I start pressing on the pedal, it will slowly start to feed the fabric through and it'll start to sew. Now watch what happens. Well, it's working. We're going all the way through. So now, I'm just going to lift the foot up, take my fabric out, cut it off, and now, as you see, I simply started and stopped without any anchors whatsoever. So now, if I pull on my fabric, you can see the thread's pulling apart. If you were, if this was clothing, eventually, I'm sure you can tell the whole thing will fall apart very easily. So what you want to do is when you start off, put this in the machine, lower the foot, and now I'm going to sew a little bit, but now I'm going to put it in reverse and back up a little bit. Forward, back, forward, and now I'll finish my stitch. Oh, if I want to stop here, put it in reverse, back up a little bit. Forward, reverse, forward, and now I'm going to rotate my balance wheel here until I can get my needle out. And if you're wondering what I'm doing, I'm rotating the wheel until the needle's sticking out of the fabric. You wouldn't want to try to pull the fabric out while the needle's stuck all the way through it. So now I'm going to pull the fabric out of the back. I recommend using the pair of scissors, but I cheat. So now if you take a look at the stitch, now you see here and here, there are these little knots, these spots where I went back and forth. And those spots, very solid. There's no way that's going to pull apart. That's how you do a straight stitch. So now, what if these stitches are too close together? What if I wanted to be able to spread them out a little bit? Now that's quite easy. I just use this control here. And okay, right now it's set to 2. Yeah, let's see what happens if we set it to 3. I'm going to insert this in the machine and repeat the process. I'm going to lower the foot and go forward a little bit, go back a little bit, go forward a little bit, go back a little bit. Now I can already tell it's moving back and forth a lot more than it did. Now let's see what happens when I go all the way across our piece of fabric. Oh, we're at the end. Reverse, forward, reverse, forward. And now, as long as I can get this, and you can tell up here whether or not the wheel's in the right place. When that's at its highest, you're usually free to pull your fabric out. And now, take a look at the stitches. You can see there's a lot more space between them. Yeah. If I turned it all the way, then they would greatly increase that space. But this is straight stitch. Let's do a zigzag. So if you take a look at the controls here, you can tell there's a few different types. I'm just going to go to a straight zigzag, the next one over, and repeat the exact same process. You guys are probably starting to get good at this now. Feed this into the machine. Lower the foot. Now, I want to leave the space kind of medium, so I'll leave it between 2 and 3. And let's go forward a little bit. Reverse. Forward. Reverse. Now, you'll probably notice that the machine, the needle is actually moving right to left as it moves. So watch what happens as I do my stitch. All right, time for some tricks. Now, I've left the needle inside the fabric on purpose because by lifting the foot now I can, oh, look at that. I can go 90 degrees and make a turn. This is also a great way of being able to see the stitch that we've put in as expected. It's a zigzag. Now, by changing the space between the stitches, of course, we can change that zigzag from a really loose zigzag to, here, let's try something a little more extreme. We're going to go down to 1. Now, let's see what happens. All right, the needle's still inside the fabric. I'm going to do a corner again. I'm going to go this way. Now, you see how the stitches drastically changed? The stitches are a lot closer together. All right, so now let's change it to a really, really loose stitch. All right, needle's in, so I'm going to cheat and go around the corner. Now, you can tell this one, there's a lot of space between those zigzags. So that's practically a straight stitch at that point. So, as you see, sewing is really easy. Here, let's come full circle. I'm going to switch it midway. Oh, look, I'm a rebel. I'm going into a straight stitch now. Oh, I want to finish it, so I'm going to do my little reverse trick. And now, okay, turn the balance wheel until it's up. Lift the foot, pull my fabric out. I always pull the fabric back. You'll notice I always pull it back this way because I don't want to untangle. And as you see, what a mess. Now, of course, with practice, you'll be able to do a much better job than this. This is sketchy at best, but now we've learned how to do a number of different stitches. Now, every once in a while, you're going to need to make one further adjustment. Now, if you look at the top of the machine, there's some other stuff you don't need. But one of the adjustments on all sewing machines is the tension adjustment. Now, the tension adjustment is exactly what you would think. Now, let's say that I'm doing a thin piece of material like this. The tension's set pretty good right now. It looks like the fabric's nice and snug. The thread isn't sticking out there particularly loose. Now, what if I was doing a couple of layers of fleece? What if I was doing something that was really, really thick? Well, this amount of tension, if I ran it through the machine the way that it is now, what you'd probably have happen is the threads would actually pinch, would literally like squish the fabric. There would be so much tension on it that it would be very likely that eventually those threads would break from all the fabric trying to push out. So sometimes you want to be able to decrease the tension. So if I'm going through, let's say I'm I'm making a pair of pajamas out of fleece. It's a really light, fluffy fabric. Well, I don't want to take 50 layers of it, compress it down into this space, and then count on this thread tension resulting. That's not going to happen. So if I'm doing something that's really, really thin, I'm going to want to increase the tension. If I'm doing something that's really thick, I'm going to want to decrease the tension. Now, of course, I'd have to do multiple different types of fabrics to be able to demonstrate this. But I find when you start doing your stitch, if the threads appear wobbly, chances are you don't have enough thread tension. You may want to turn it up a little bit. Likewise, if you're feeding a lot of material through here, like let's say that I'm doing a hem, and I've got a couple of layers of fabric folded. Now at this point, I'm probably going to want to decrease the tension a little bit because all that tension could possibly break the thread.